In the spring of 1519, the first strange ships cut the horizon of the Aztec world. Their canvas like pale wings and men in bright armor, riding animals no one among us had seen before. To the people of Tenochtitlan, it appeared like a visitation from another season of gods, beasts bearing riders, faces behind iron, and thunder that spat from the ends of slender poles. Messengers ran back to the city with news half prayer and half panic. Some declared these men gods returned from the sea, others whispered doom. The city prepared gifts and ceremonies, and beneath the ritual, the air tasted of foreboding and calculation. Hernán Cortés arrived not as a pilgrim, but as a man intent on advantage and wealth. His band was small but cunning, and he found in the politics of the valley a tool to be used. The Tlaxcalans and many tributaries, who had long borne Aztec exactions, saw in these strangers a chance to overturn old grievances. Cortés forged alliances with patience. He promised aid, shared arms, and offered the prospects of punishment for old tyrannies. What for Aztec envoys was ritual, and deference became in Spanish hands leverage and a way to convert ceremony into strategy. Cortés moved like a man who had learned that politics among strangers is a battlefield without banners. He read opportunity where others read custom. The early meetings were filled with ceremony and mutual misreading. Gifts moved in processions, feathers, cacao, and finely worked ornaments offered and received amid the smoke of censers, while Spaniards in metal and leather offered glass beads and mirrors that gleamed like new currency. The meanings of gestures diverged. Mexican nobles invoked lineage and sacred time, reading omens and precedent. Europeans spoke in crowns, letters, and the arithmetic of coin. Cortés, with allied warriors at his flank, paraded into the heart of the capital with a confidence that cracked the etiquette of the court. The capital, with its canals and causeways, became a stage where meanings collided and small offences took on great weight. Violence grew from small things and then spread like wildfire. A market quarrel, a detainment, a frightened soldier's blade. Any spark could set a neighbourhood alight. The Spanish, anxious to secure supply and prevent sudden purge, struck with brutal efficiency. The Mexica answered with fierce reprisals born of defending hearth and altar. Street fighting turned plazas into scenes of horror, smoke, broken cloth, and bodies where merchants had once called prices and children raced. Men who had once bargained for produce now bargained for lives. Neighbours turned on neighbours in the heat of survival. Siege and counterattack fed each other until the city itself thinned beneath the strain. Beyond the immediate slaughter, an invisible catastrophe moved among the living. Smallpox and other old-world diseases arrived with the newcomers, invisible and relentless. They passed from ship to market to household, taking parent and child alike within days, leaving orphans and empty hearths. Agricultural work faltered as labour vanished. Storehouses were left untended, and caravans failed to return. With that went food, the rhythm of tribute, and the social rituals that bound communities. Prayer and ritual could not stand against microbes. The long arc of calamity had begun. The fall of Tenochtitlan thus became a model of disastrous first contact, a collision of military force, political manipulation, and biological catastrophe. Conquerors learned that alliances with local disgruntled groups could be weaponized, that a handful of Europeans with firearms and resolve could overturn large polities when native divisions were exploited. Indigenous peoples learned, at terrible cost, that the arrival of strangers could remake the map of power and introduce calamities that endured long after the banners fell. The city's destruction was not merely a battlefield loss, it was an institutional and spiritual unmaking. If one frames this, through a single eyewitness, an elder of the market with soot on his hands, a runner between temples, or a young warrior who had learned to bear both spear and bread. The testimony becomes intimate and unbearable. The first sighting of those pale sails is remembered not as a diplomatic moment, but as the opening of a wound that widened until the city could not close it. To tell that encounter as disaster is to hold both the initial awe and the slow, grinding grief that followed. It is to remember that first contact can be the beginning of unmaking rather than the start of understanding. When Captain James Cook first sailed into the waters of Hawaii in 1778, his ships were like omens cut into the sea, tall, white and moving with unnatural grace. To the islanders, the arrival of the Resolution and Discovery coincided with the festival of Lono, a season of peace and fertility when offerings were laid and weapons laid down. The strangers, pale-skinned and garbed in fabric and metal, seemed at first like the god himself returning from his distant journey across the sea. Canoes filled the water around the ships, bringing fruit, pigs, and woven gifts. Songs of welcome rose through the air, and the sailors, exhausted from their Pacific crossing, found themselves greeted with kindness, curiosity, and wonder. Cook, ever the navigator and collector, saw not gods but opportunities, fresh food, timber, and new points on the map. Yet he also understood, if only dimly, the reverence with which he was treated. He allowed the ceremonies to unfold, accepting garlands and prostrations, perhaps flattered, perhaps wary. His journals speak of a civility beyond expectation, yet his officers noted the way local chiefs touched their foreheads to his feet. No matter the captain's intention, the image of divinity clung to him. The islanders and the British each thought they were performing diplomacy. In truth, they were performing misinterpretations. For several weeks, the exchange of gifts and gestures continued. Cook mapped harbours, studied customs, and filled his holds with provisions. Islanders paddled out daily, offering produce for iron nails, which they prized beyond measure. The bay became a floating market of barter and laughter. But below the calm, tension gathered. The British sailors' curiosity sometimes broke taboos. They entered sacred enclosures, handled ritual objects, and treated symbols of rank as curiosities. To islanders steeped in kapu law, these were not minor offences but profanations. Courtesy masked resentment, and each side began to measure the other in new, uneasy terms. When the Resolution finally departed, the farewell was warm but edged with fatigue. Yet fate twisted back on itself. A storm at sea damaged a mast, and within days Cook's ships limped back to the same bay they had just left. To return so soon, after the rituals of farewell, struck the islanders as a violation of cosmic order. The god had departed and should not return until the appointed season. Suspicion flared. Respect gave way to unease. The bay that had once been filled with offerings now bristled with wary eyes and tight hands gripping spears. Theft lit the spark that burned the bridge. A small boat from the Discovery went missing, and Cook, desperate to enforce authority, resolved to take the local Ali'i Nui, the ruling chief, as a hostage until the property was returned. It was a tactic he had used in other islands, but here it shattered the delicate fabric of reverence that had held the peace. As Cook and his marines marched toward the beach with their muskets, the crowd gathered behind them grew restless, angry, and unafraid. Shouts echoed, stones flew. The chief's wife begged him not to go. The crowd surged. The god now looked mortal. On the black sand of Kealakekwa Bay, chaos ignited in seconds. Cook fired his musket, striking one man, and the marines followed. The islanders answered with spears, clubs, and stones. A blow from behind toppled the captain into the shallow surf, and as he tried to rise, a dagger flashed downward. Witnesses later wrote that he fell silently, the surf staining red around him. The sailors dragged back what they could of his body under fire from both sides. When the smoke cleared, the man the world called discoverer of so many lands lay dead in the land he had only just learned to misread. In the aftermath, rituals continued, not of mourning, but of meaning. To the Hawaiians, Cook's death was not murder but balance restored, a god revealed as mortal and returned to the cycle of life and death. Portions of his remains were treated with respect, in keeping with local custom, while his crew, bereft and frightened, wrote of barbarous rites. The two sides had not even shared a common grammar for reverence. The expedition sailed away, leaving behind a wound in the record of exploration, proof that knowledge gained at the edge of the world can cost more than ignorance left untouched. Cook's death in Hawaii remains one of history's most haunting collisions of worlds. It was not just the fall of a man, but the end of an illusion, the idea that discovery was a one-sided act. In that narrow bay, two civilizations met, each certain of its place in the cosmic order, each mistaking the other's devotion or fear for understanding. When the last sail vanished over the horizon, the islanders' songs turned again to silence, and the sea reclaimed its calm. The story endures as a warning. First contact is not always a meeting of worlds. It is often their undoing. When the British first anchored off the coast of Van Diemen's Land in 1803, the island lay veiled in mist, wild with the scent of eucalyptus and sea spray. To the newcomers it seemed an untouched paradise, forests full of game, rivers alive with fish, and open plains ready for farms. To the Palawa peoples who had lived there for over 10,000 years, it was already a well-tended home, a network of territories, stories and sacred sites stretching from mountain to shore. The first encounters were hesitant but curious. Both sides approached with gestures of peace, exchanges of food and trinkets, and the awkward smiles of people trying to bridge a gap that neither language nor worldview could cross. But beneath that fragile civility, fear flickered. The British saw a wilderness to claim. The Tasmanians saw ghosts made flesh from the sea. The settlers' arrival marked not a meeting but a slow and terrible unravelling. As the colony expanded, the Palawa watched forests fall to axes and fires, rivers fouled by livestock, and hunting grounds fenced off. Their food sources vanished, their sacred sites were trampled, skirmishes began over stolen game and trespass. At first isolated, then constant, the settlers' weapons were crude muskets but deadly enough, and retribution came with iron precision. When sheep went missing, whole camps were burned. When colonists disappeared, militias rode into the bush. Violence became the new language between them, and no one translated it correctly. By 1824, the uneasy peace was gone. The settlers outnumbered the Palawa, and the British authorities began to speak of extirpation as though it were a policy, not a crime. The newspapers called it the Black War, though it was less a war than a slow, one-sided hunt. The Palawa fought back with courage and cunning, striking farms under the cover of night, rescuing children, seizing food, but the British line kept tightening. They brought in bounty hunters, assigned convicts as trackers, and ordered capture parties to sweep the countryside. Official letters described it as pacification. Diaries described it more truthfully as extermination. Among the records of this time, few voices of the Tasmanians survive. Theirs were not a written people, and the British rarely wrote with sympathy. But from missionary journals and rare testimonies, fragments emerge. One survivor spoke of the white smoke that never leaves, the fires of the settlers seen from the high hills, spreading year by year. Another described the first musket shot. It made the wind break. To the Palawa, these new arrivals were not merely men, but forces of chaos, tearing open the order of the world. To the colonists, they were obstacles, souls to be saved, bodies to be cleared, depending on who held the gun that day. In 1830, the government launched the Black Line, a human chain of more than 2,000 settlers, soldiers and convicts stretching across the island. They marched from the north toward the south, driving the remaining Aboriginal bands like hunted game. It was one of the largest manhunts in colonial history, but it caught almost no one. The Tasmanians melted into the forests, surviving by silence and memory. The campaign cost thousands of pounds and achieved nothing but exhaustion. Yet in the years that followed, the few remaining Palawa were coaxed or coerced into surrender. They were sent to Flinders Island, where officials promised food and safety but delivered disease, despair, and death. Within a generation, almost an entire people was gone. Among the last survivors was Truganini, a woman who had seen her family murdered and her world erased. She told a missionary, "I have seen the land broken, and I cannot live where my people are no more." Her story, like the land itself, became a wound carried into the next century. To the settlers, Tasmania was now civilized, a place of farms and towns. To the Palawa, it was a graveyard of songs. The British kept journals filled with observations of flora and fauna, measurements and maps, but none could capture what had been lost, a civilization of hunters, healers, and dreamers, now reduced to a handful of names. Historians would later call it a genocide, though the word did not yet exist when the muskets cracked and the forests burned. For those who lived it, it was something beyond words, a silence that devoured stories. Even in the official dispatches, there are flickers of unease, officers writing of a melancholy duty, settlers recording nightmares. First contact in Tasmania had begun with smiles and ended with extinction. The British thought they had discovered a new world. In truth, they had only extinguished an old one. The Tasmanian catastrophe remains one of the most devastating accounts of first contact in all of human history, not because it was swift, but because it was slow. It showed how misunderstanding, once mixed with greed and fear, becomes destiny. Each side thought the other might be reasoned with. But when the last fires dimmed on Flinders Island, and the wind carried only the whisper of the waves, the story of first contact there was complete. It ended not with discovery or conquest, but with the quiet disappearance of a people who had once believed the earth itself could never forget them. When the sun rose over the plains of Natal on January 22nd, 1879, the British camp at Isandlwana seemed at peace. Rows of white tents gleamed against the red earth, surrounded by the distant hum of cicadas and the steady clink of hammers as soldiers went about their morning drills. To the officers, it was another day in a campaign they expected to win easily. After all, they were the British Empire, armed with rifles, artillery, and discipline, marching against savages, armed with spears and shields. Few among them knew that, beyond the tall grass and the ridges of the escarpment, an army larger than any they could imagine was already closing in. The Zulu kingdom had risen under the iron discipline of Shaka, and though he was long dead, his system of regiments, the impi, remained. To the Zulu, war was not chaos, but ceremony, bound by tradition and precision. They had seen invaders before, but none so dismissive, none so sure of their own invincibility. The British had crossed the border into Zululand without declaration, demanding submission from King Cetshwayo. He had sent back word of peace, but his messengers were ignored. Now, as the Redcoats made camp beneath the lone mountain called Isandlwana, the Zulu warriors gathered in the valleys beyond, painted, armed, and waiting for the signal to strike. From the high ridge, a British scout spotted movement in the grass, shadows, glints of spearheads. By mid-morning, reports reached Colonel Pauline, but confusion reigned. Orders from Lord Chelmsford had split the force in two. Half had marched east with him, leaving barely 1,000 men behind. Still few believed the Zulus would dare attack. The officers debated, hesitated, adjusted formations. Then around noon, a sound rolled across the plain, a low, thunderous chant that seemed to come from the earth itself. The Zulu horns had opened their charge. Within minutes, the hills erupted in black waves of warriors, advancing with terrifying coordination. They came in the shape of the horns of the buffalo, a tactic perfected over generations, the center holding firm, the horns curling around to encircle. The British formed firing lines, steady at first, their volleys tearing into the front ranks, the air filled with gunsmoke, screams, and the deep rhythmic roar of thousands of voices. But the Zulus did not break. Their numbers swallowed the plain, 20,000 against barely 1,000. As ammunition wagons jammed and orders broke down, the red line began to crumble. One officer wrote later that the firing became a desperate, furious thing, each man shooting for his life, no time to think or reload. Within the hour, the British camp dissolved into chaos. Men fought among the tents, stabbing with bayonets as the Zulus surged through the smoke. The defenders were overrun, dragged down, cut apart, horses bolted, guns were seized, and the white tents turned crimson. Witnesses who escaped later described the sound, the rhythmic beating of Zulu shields, the cries of the dying, the strange wordless harmony of a people fighting for their land. It was not a battle, but a storm, and when it passed, the camp was gone. Over 1,300 British soldiers lay dead, and the Union Jack that had fluttered so proudly was trampled into the red dirt. When word of Isandlwana reached London, disbelief turned to outrage. How could a native army annihilate one of the Empire's finest regiments? The reports that followed were filled with confusion, excuses, and contradictions. But the truth, buried beneath official language, was simpler. The British had underestimated the Zulu. They had marched into a land they did not understand, dismissed warnings, and divided their forces out of arrogance. The Zulu, bound by discipline and pride, had answered in kind, with precision, courage, and an unshakable sense that they were defending not just territory, but the soul of their kingdom. Even in victory, the Zulu paid dearly. Thousands lay dead on the field, their triumph short-lived, for the British vengeance that followed would be merciless. Within months, reinforcements arrived, armed with Gatling guns and the full weight of imperial rage. The Zulu kingdom was broken, its leaders captured, its land carved up and sold. But the memory of Isandlwana endured, a moment when the map of empire briefly tore, and the myth of European invincibility was exposed for what it was, a story men told themselves to justify conquest. The survivors of that day, both British and Zulu, spoke of the same strange stillness afterward. The mountain, Isandlwana, loomed above them like a witness that could neither speak nor forget. The wind carried the smell of gunpowder and blood, and the vultures circled overhead. For the British, it was humiliation. For the Zulu, it was vindication and sorrow in equal measure. And for history, it remains one of the clearest lessons of first contact turned disastrous. That arrogance, once mistaken for destiny, becomes the seed of downfall. The sea ice closed around them like iron. In the summer of 1845, two British ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, set sail under Sir John Franklin, tasked with completing the Northwest Passage through the Arctic. The men aboard were the pride of the Royal Navy, confident, well supplied, and armed with the latest technology of their age. They carried 3 years of provisions, fine china for officers' dinners, even a hand-cranked organ to lift morale. To the Admiralty, it was a voyage of discovery. To the sailors, it was adventure. None of them imagined it would end in horror, or that the only voices to tell their story would not be British at all, but Inuit. For the first months, all went well. The ships moved north through Baffin Bay, then west into the Lancaster Sound. Letters sent home spoke of optimism and good spirits. But then came the winter, and the ice did not break. Year after year, the sea froze earlier and thawed later. The ships became prisoners of the Arctic, black hulls trapped in white silence. The temperature dropped below -40 degrees Celsius, and coal supplies dwindled. The men began to suffer frostbite, scurvy, madness. When the expedition failed to return, the Admiralty launched search after search, but none found survivors. It was only the Inuit, the people who truly knew the ice, who saw what became of them. Decades later, Inuit elders recounted what their ancestors had witnessed. They spoke of strange wooden islands locked in the ice, and men with pale faces staggering across the snow in rags. They traded small items with them, spoons, buttons, bits of metal. But as the months passed, the visitors grew gaunt and desperate. One Inuit woman described them as men who had forgotten how to live. When the ships were finally abandoned, groups of survivors set out across the frozen wastes, dragging sledges laden with silverware, books, and instruments, relics of civilization that now meant nothing. The Inuit saw them collapse one by one, their tracks disappearing into the wind. When the first British search parties arrived years later, they dismissed many of the Inuit stories. Reports of cannibalism, of bones cracked for marrow, flesh cooked over makeshift fires, were branded lies, the ravings of savages. It was inconceivable to Victorian England that Royal Navy men could descend to such depths, but time and science proved the Inuit right. In the 1980s, archaeologists uncovered skeletal remains on King William Island. The bones bore unmistakable cut marks, evidence of butchery. Even more chilling were the facial expressions preserved in the frozen peat. Open-mouthed skulls, jaws locked as if mid-scream. The Inuit had not exaggerated. If anything, they had softened the truth. What the Inuit understood, and the British did not, was that the Arctic was alive, but merciless. To survive, one had to listen to it, adapt, and move lightly upon it. The Franklin men came as conquerors of nature, not students of it. They brought fine uniforms and brass instruments, but not humility. When Inuit hunters first encountered their camps, they found that the sailors had burned their own boats for heat, then perished beside them. One elder recalled seeing piles of unopened tins, food they could not eat. The solder used to seal them had poisoned the crew with lead, twisting their minds and weakening their bodies. The Empire's triumph of engineering had become its own undoing. As the ships Erebus and Terror vanished beneath the ice, they left behind a caution written not in ink but in bone. When explorers finally found the wrecks in 2014 and 2016, perfectly preserved beneath the Arctic waters, they were like ghost ships, their timbers intact, their silence total. Inuit oral tradition had kept their memory alive for over 160 years, preserving details of location and fate that Western historians had ignored. The truth had always been there, just not in the language of maps and manifests, but in story and memory, passed from elder to child. In the end, the Franklin expedition stands as one of history's most haunting first contacts, not between two nations, but between two ways of knowing. The British sought to master the Arctic with charts and compasses. The Inuit had mastered it through respect, rhythm, and endurance. One perished, the other endured. When we look back at the frozen relics, at the frozen faces of those men, we are not just seeing explorers. We are seeing the limits of empire, of arrogance, of the belief that nature and its people could be conquered without consequence.
The Arctic still holds them, the bones, the ships, the story. The wind that moves across the ice today moves over the same graves the Inuit once found, over the relics of men who thought they could command the North. In the end, their maps failed, their science failed, and their silence told the rest. What survived was not the empire, but the echo, the memory carried by the Inuit, who alone remained to tell the truth of what happens when one world meets another and neither understands the cost.